Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Welcome back. Welcome back. Please try to find a seat, scooch in, and make some room for everybody if you can, so we can all have a seat. Welcome back. Hope everyone is enjoying seeing old friends and making some new ones. My name is Daniel Anderson. I'm a water law fellow at the Getchell Wilkinson Center. And I have the honor of introducing our second session on a topic I'm particularly interested in, which is how do we recognize, preserve, and renew the Colorado as a living river? So many existing laws and policies were designed to divert water out of the Colorado River for off-stream consumption. And the Colorado River is frequently compared to as a plumbing system. You can find diagrams depicting the Colorado River as merely a series of pipes, pools, and faucets. However, some efforts are emerging to protect and recover the living qualities of the Colorado River. This panel features 3 speakers who work on just that, and we're very lucky to have them with us today. So first, Amy Moyer, Chief of Strategy for the Colorado River Water Conservation District, will share some important information on their work to preserve flows in the Colorado through the Shoshone Water Rights Preservation Project. Next, John Bezdek, shareholder at Water and Law Power Group and attorney for the Colorado River Indian Tribes, will share powerful recent efforts by the Colorado River Indian Tribes to recognize the rights of the Colorado River. And last, Zach Podmore, journalist and author of the book Life After Deadpool, Lake Powell's Last Days and the Rebirth of the Colorado River, will share some illuminating and striking changes already underway in Glen Canyon. You can find more information about our panelists in our full program, and after they each get a chance to present, we'll have about 30 minutes for a moderated discussion. So don't forget to send questions into the Slido team as you have them. With that, I'd like to invite Amy up to the podium.
Thank you, Daniel. Again, my name is Amy Moyer. I'm going to talk about our Shoshone Water Rights Preservation effort. And when Daniel and I had our pre-meeting, he said, "Have you looked at where you are in the agenda and who you have to follow?" And I said, yes, I'm up for the challenge here because this is a basin that is so in need of long-term durable solutions. And this project really is emblematic of that. But before I get into the Shoshone water rights, I want to give just a quick overview of where I'm situated in the basin. And so my organization, the Colorado River District, was formed by Colorado's General Assembly in 1937. We're a local government entity with a mission to protect and advocate for users on Colorado's western slope. So we represent water users across 15 counties on Colorado's western slope, the main stem of the Colorado River, the Yampa White Green, and the Uncompahgre and Gunnison as principal tributaries to that river. And what I want to mention is that we represent some of the most diverse communities in Colorado and on our western slope. We represent communities like Aspen and Vail and Crested Butte, those resort communities. We also represent some of the most rural areas of our state with agriculturally based economies. And that's important to think about as we talk about the coalition that we've built related to the Shoshone water rights. For those of you who have no idea where these counties are, this is where we're located in conjunction with the broader Colorado River Basin that brings us all here today. We're right at the headwaters, and what I want to note is that 65% of the natural flow of the Colorado River originates right within our boundaries at the Colorado River District. And so we view our role as we are the start of this immense chain and ecosystem of the Colorado River Basin that you all know these statistics that serves 40 million people, 5 million acres of irrigated agriculture, 30 federally recognized tribes, national parks, national monuments. And so we take our position seriously that we are the start of this immense chain and the headwaters of the Colorado River. And so as I turn to the Shoshone Water Rights Preservation effort, This is a project that we're working on Colorado's western slope and within the upper basin to permanently protect historic flows in the Colorado River that are tied to the Shoshone Hydroelectric Power Plant. This is truly a long-term generational project that we've been working on for decades and that has moved quickly over the last few years in earnest. But to set the stage, I need to talk about the Shoshone Hydropower Plant. That power plant is owned and operated by Public Service Company of Colorado. It's a subsidiary of Xcel Energy. It's located right in Glenwood Canyon. It's a beautiful canyon about 2.5 miles west of here, right off of I-70. It's a small brown building that so many people miss because they're trying not to drive off the road through that canyon. But it was built in 1909. So this power plant has been operating for over 115 years. It provides power for about 15,000 customers. But truly, the story here is far beyond this power plant's ability to produce power. The story that I'm here to tell is the importance of how they produce power with two of the largest, most influential water rights on the Colorado main stem. And so the Shoshone water rights are made up of a senior and a junior water right with appropriation dates of 1902 and 1929. Those water rights have a collective flow rate of 1408 CFS, and by virtue of their size and seniority have created a foundational flow regime on this upper Colorado stretch of the river. And the reason for that, if you see this map shows the Colorado River from its headwaters starting in Rocky Mountain National Park down to the Utah-Colorado border. You can see the green star there is where the Shoshone Hydroelectric Power Plant is located. And the key drivers in this upper Colorado River stretch are our large Trans-Mountain diversion projects that bring water over here to the Front Range and large reservoir projects that help facilitate that. The beauty of the Shoshone water rights is they are senior to those key drivers in the basin, in the system. And so again, by virtue of their seniority, they command flows that start at the headwaters of the Colorado River down to the Shoshone Hydroelectric Power Plant, where they're used non-consumptively, meaning that that water flows from the headwaters down to Glenwood Canyon. They are used to produce clean energy through the power plant, and all of that water is diverted right back into the river for uses downstream. And that historical flow regime has multiple benefits. First and foremost, it has immense ecological benefits by supporting base flows for over 250 miles of the river within Colorado. It supports many of our critical aquatic ecosystem. We've talked about that this is truly still an alive and living river. It supports native fish habitat. It supports critical habitat for the 4 endangered fish. It supports stretches of river that are eligible for wild and scenic designation, and these water rights are looked to as a long-term protection measure for those outstandingly remarkable values. By also providing those clean, cool flows, it supports our communities that rely on the Colorado River for drinking water. It allows those dilution flows for a river that's naturally salty and full of sediment. It allows those communities that rely on the Colorado River for their drinking water to use their water treatment plants and to abide by their wastewater permits. It also supports local food production, both from a water security perspective, but in Colorado, our Palisade peaches, our orchards, they're very sensitive to salt and salinity. And so this clean, cool water from the headwaters helps support our local food production. It supports our river recreation economy. So in Colorado, that's an $18.8 billion industry. Given the drought year that we've seen, there are not many stretches that are going to support our river outfitters and our local businesses. But the Shoshone Rapids, where the water releases from that power plant, is going to be operational all summer. And that's going to keep so many of our businesses and our families and our communities that rely on river recreation afloat. So for decades, there's been a coalition of groups, a broad-based coalition that I'll talk about, that have been looking for ways to permanently protect the exercise of these water rights. So remember that these water rights are currently decreed for hydropower production. They're located in Glenwood Canyon that has had its fair share of fires and floods, and this power plant has been operating for over a century. So there has long been risk that but for temporary agreements that have expiration dates that are not fully decreed by Colorado's Water Court, that if that power plant were to go offline, we would lose the ability to exercise these water rights. And this foundational flow regime that has been talked about as a keystone, foundational, the bottom in a house of cards as to how the Colorado River operates within our state, we would lose the ability to exercise those water rights. And so for decades, a coalition of local governments from across Colorado, the Colorado River District, drinking water providers, irrigation water providers, have been looking for permanent ways to protect the exercise of these water rights. And so in December of 2023, the Colorado River District entered into a purchase and sale agreement with Xcel Energy to purchase these water rights for a purchase price of $99 million. We will lease those water rights back to Xcel to continue to be used for hydropower production for as long as that power plant can continue to operate. But we'll also add an additional beneficial use by offering these water rights as part of the state's in-stream flow program. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail as we go. And we have 4 contingencies to reach the closing table of this deal. The first is that we have to complete an in-stream flow acquisition and agreement with the state of Colorado. So the Colorado Water Conservation Board is the only entity within Colorado water law that can exercise this additional non-consumptive use of a water right for in-stream flow. We completed that process at the end of last year, and I'll talk about it in a little more detail. We have to go to water court to add this additional beneficial use of in-stream flow so that when these water rights are not being used for hydropower production, whether it's temporarily when the power plant is offline or permanently, these water rights can revert to be exercised for in-stream flow use. We have to complete our fundraising effort for the $99 million purchase price, and this transaction has to go to the Public Utilities Commission for approval on the disposition of proceeds. I want to talk about the Shoshone Reach and the in-stream flow process. So last May, the Colorado River District, we offered to the Colorado Water Conservation Board the use of these water rights for in-stream flow purposes for a 2.4-mile stretch within Glenwood Canyon that mimics how these water rights are used for hydropower production today. And I just want to pause here with just a quick interlude of there's clearly a lot of questions, a lot of plus-ups, and before you ask me a Free River question, everyone thumbs it up. I thought I would just address it a little bit here of, you know, today in one point of time, while there's not a call on the main stem, that's largely due to voluntary actions that many of our senior water right holders are taking because we recognize how dry a year it is. We recognize that water users in the Grand Valley and the lower portion of our state are trying to help support irrigators in the upper part of our state get through a summer that we've never seen before. It's also not on call because the Shoshone Power Plant has been having challenges in terms of its operation. So again, it's a century-year-old. We have seen this power plant continue to have increased outages over the last 20 years with this in-stream flow in place. And when we effectuate this deal, what would be happening today is exercising these Shoshone water rights for in-stream flow purposes and fully pulling that water west and downstream within its native basin. So I just wanted to kind of add that point here, and there's a lot of people that can talk more about the Free River conditions. But we did offer these water rights as part of the state's in-stream flow program. That program has been in operation for 50 years, so really what better opportunity to have this one-of-one opportunity to bolster the state's in-stream flow program. The key consideration for that process was whether the Shoshone water rights will preserve and improve the environment to a reasonable degree. So you can see some pictures here. We went through numerous habitat studies to really demonstrate the importance of the fishery within that 2.4-mile stretch. We were out doing fish collection studies in partnership with Colorado Parks and Wildlife in really cold conditions in that canyon. We did, in fact, determine that there is immense ecological and habitat value. Turns out when you put more water in a river, that's helpful to the fish in the aquatic environment. But we went through a multi-month contested hearing on this process of whether the state should accept these water rights into their in-stream flow portfolio. We went through 16 hours of hearings. What's interesting is that nobody contested, and our primary objectors were our large Trans Mountain diversion projects on the Front Range. Nobody has contested the value of these water rights, the value that they have for the in-stream flow program, or their ecological value to the system. One of the issues at play was how these water rights are going to be co-managed into the future. And so I mentioned that the Colorado River District will purchase these water rights, will both lease them back to Xcel for hydropower use, and will also have offered them as part of the in-stream flow program. At the end of the day, we came out of that process with a unanimous decision by the Colorado Water Conservation Board to accept these water rights as part of our in-stream flow program. We do have this co-management approach where Colorado's Western Slope can work with the state of Colorado to make sure that these water rights are in fact exercised for in-stream flow purposes. And in years like this, there are considerations of how do we make sure that the basin as a whole and all of those that rely on the Colorado River can use their water rights. Another issue that's of importance and that was discussed during this process is now that we're in water court, one of the actions that we need to take is determine the historical use of these water rights. So this is a water right that's been in operation for over a century, lots and lots of data on it. It's gone through many flow regimes on the river. We have to determine what is that historical use number of these water rights. So when we say what we're looking to do here is to preserve how these water rights have been historically used for over a century, certainly there's going to be a lot of methods, a lot of consideration of what that number is. And the importance of water court in Colorado is that we will have to accomplish standards that there is no injury to other water users. We're not enlarging these water rights. And if you think back to the map and you see Shoshone in these water rights, the standard of no injury and no large enlargement factors into upstream diverters. So many of the Front Range entities that have been objectors in this case, we can't injure those upstream, but we also can't injure those return flows that folks downstream have relied upon. So it's really important that we get this historical use number right. I have confidence in the water court process with its deadlines. We're bringing together everyone's expert engineers that we're going to find a historical use that best represents how these water rights have been operated. We have to accomplish our purchase price of $99 million. This is a really great story to tell and really highlights the broad-based nature of this coalition. We have so many people behind us. We have cattlemen standing next to river recreators. We have drinking water providers that provide water to communities. We have irrigation water providers for local food production. So we have a $99 million purchase price. When the Colorado River District signed our purchase and sale agreement, we committed $20 million to the purchase price. We then went for a one-to-one match with the state of Colorado, where Colorado's General Assembly appropriated $20 million during their 2024 session. We also have $17.3 million across 40 different local and regional entities across Colorado. Those are amounts large and small. Again, those are communities that are providing water for irrigation. Those are drinking water providers. Those are regional entities and universities like Colorado Mesa University that have all come together and said, these water rights are so important to our communities, economies, and the health of the Colorado River, that so many communities that have the least to give have said, I would like to contribute to this. I can't tell you, as somebody who has worked really closely with this fundraising effort, you don't often have people calling you saying, how do I contribute to this? And every single decision across those 40 million local entities has been unanimous. And you never have that within water, and you never have that within local government. So it's been incredible to have this coalition behind us. We also, just in the last 2 weeks, received an announcement from the Bureau of Reclamation that they are moving forward with a $40 million federal funding award with dollars from the Inflation Reduction Act, recognizing that these water rights have system-wide benefits that support the overall Colorado River Basin. It supports preserving flows that are in the Colorado River. So that brings us to a total commitment really since December of 2023, which is unheard of 97.3 million. We have 1.7 million left to go, and we are working with communities right now that are saying, I want to be in on this, and we are going to get that financial commitment across the finish line for a small agency on Colorado's western slope. And really what this brings me to is a slide that's really hard to read on purpose, because we have over 120 organizations, entities, elected representatives from all members of our federal delegation, our state, that have stood with us. And that is how we've gotten so far, is we wouldn't have gotten through the state of Colorado process. We wouldn't be fundraising the amounts we have to date without this broad-based coalition that has showed up and has been vocal and understands that this project provides both the long-term permanent benefits that this basin needs, but supports so many multitude of uses that both keeps this Colorado River alive, supports local food production, it supports clean drinking water for communities. There's not another project out here that provides those water security benefits and preservation benefits than this project, in my mind. And I want to wrap up to emphasize the generational investment here. You know, with any project, we're really looking at the long game. I'm looking at this for the benefit of my children. I'm a mom of two small children, 2 and 6, and I want to share a story about one of my children. So when you live on Colorado's western slope, you have the benefit of living near a number of ski resorts. And what I have learned as a mom is it becomes very quick that your young children become better skiers than you, especially for somebody who learned to ski as an adult. And so I'm riding up the chairlift with my 6-year-old, and he turns to me and he says, Mom, can we go ski through the trees? And I'm like, oh my God, that's my nightmare. He's 6, I don't want to ski through the trees. And he turns to me and he looks at me and he says, Mom, you can do hard things. Which was amazing and funny, and we skied through the trees very slowly and safely, but I just want to commend that this is a project and this is a mentality that we have had at the Colorado River District to move this project forward of we can do hard things in this basin. These are 2 quotes from Senator Bennett and Congressman Jeff Hurd after we were announced that we received the $40 million investment from the federal government. And I want to just point to something that really resonated with me from Congressman Hurd, who's been an absolute leader on this project, was that water issues in the West require persistence, partnership, and practical solutions. And that's what we've been working on with this project. It provides system-wide benefits for this entire basin. Our modeling demonstrates that in a dry year like this, the exercise of the Shoshone water rights brings about 35,000 acre-feet to the Colorado state line, which is not insignificant for the state of Colorado and the upper basin as a whole. And so as I wrap up, I just want to say, I hope this project is an example that we can do hard things in this basin, and we can still find projects that are good for the health of the Colorado River and all of those that use it. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. So my name is John Bezdek, and I am the lead water attorney for the Colorado River Indian Tribes. And we'll talk a little bit today about what CRIT has recently been doing, about a live river. But before I start, I want to acknowledge and start with tribal leadership. So in the room with me is Chairwoman Flores. I'm looking for our Vice Chairman Lamias, but maybe he's upstairs. Oh, there he is. As well as Councilwoman Welch, and she also has the youngest CRIT tribal member here, her daughter, Kalila, and then the Deputy Attorney General, Travis Ness. And I wanted to start with them because they represent tribal membership, and this is really a conversation about tribal membership. And the reality is we're going to talk this morning about legal and policy implications of what this means for CRIT and elsewhere. But it's tribal members who are living this every day. So it's tribal members who are looking at a river that is fundamentally different and are asking their leadership, what can we do about it? And so, before we got into the policy and the legal discussions, I always wanted to start with the simple fact that this is really about tribal members and it's about the next generation. So in terms of rights of nature, I think what I would say is just focus there on the bottom one. Rights of nature codify nature's right to exist. And what I would say is I would add to that and simply say it also codifies our relationship with nature. So I think it's a two-sided coin here. It's not just about nature's right to exist, it's also our ability to exist with nature and to live with nature. So I would say it's more than just the right to exist, it's also intertwined with humans and our ability to intertwine with nature. So again, in terms of rights of nature, personhood, so really personhood is a way to acknowledge that nature is living, nature is alive, and that granting personhood is just, in my estimation, a very easy way to acknowledge that point, that nature is around us, it's alive, it's living, and it's also finite. And I think we need to acknowledge that everything is finite and we need to protect it. And I think that's really a big part of what we're talking about here is doing what we can, how we can, to protect what's important to us. And that's really a lot of what we're going to talk about this morning. So rights of nature, and there are a lot of international examples, and it's heavy in international law, and you see a lot of national legislative bodies taking actions for rights of nature. I want to just focus here domestically, focus here in the US, and talk about a couple of examples just to give you a flavor of what's out there. And one of my favorite ones is White Earth Ojibwe, and they're establishing a right of nature for a food source, for a very important, culturally significant food source. And so I think gives you a flavor of that. And then, again, just a couple of examples. Out of the Pacific Northwest, the Klamath in particular, and the Yurok tribe, Daniel Cordalis from NARF, he's not here. He and his wife, Amy, longtime friends, they worked on this, and they were actually ahead of the curve and established personhood status for the Klamath River on behalf of the Yurok tribe several years ago before momentum, I'll say, started in terms of rights of nature. So I want to acknowledge Daniel. But these are just examples that we thought about at CRIT. And so I think one of the big takeaways here is that first bullet, okay? And in our estimation, it's highly personal. I mean, this is not a cookie cutter approach that we're going to do the exact same thing somebody else did. I think a right of nature is very personal. To quote Darrell Vigil, you know one tribe, you know one tribe. And so deeply personal, driven by things that are important to CRIT that may or may not be important to somebody else. But that was a huge driver is CRIT is unique to CRIT, and we wanted to do something that reflected our membership. There was significant outreach to tribal members. We had fairs. We had direct one-on-one outreach. We set up web pages and websites so members can email us. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was the reality that most tribal members were telling us that what we want to do is a reflection of what they already believe. This wasn't new to them other than the fact that we're codifying it. But this was a reflection of our membership. And so it's those things informed how we wanted to approach this, how Tribal Council moved forward. And again, we have 4 tribes that are a part of the history of CRIT. And Tribal Council wanted to go forward in a way that recognizes that there is strength in that diversity and to acknowledge contributions from all 4 tribal nations that make up CRIT. So those were the types of things that were in consideration when we were having discussions with Tribal Council. I put this slide up here because this predates any action by Tribal Council by almost a couple of years. And I wanted to put it up here because I'll put my lawyer hat on for a minute and talk about, and a recovering federal attorney, so records are important to me, and talk about establishing the record. And so before we started having serious conversations about personhood and protecting the river. In a letter to Interior a couple of years ago, foundation was already being laid. Everything starts with the river itself. It is a part of who we are, and we have a solemn obligation handed down over time from our ancestors to protect and preserve for future generations. So this really laid part of the foundation of what we were doing. And so what we're going to talk about is how we build on that foundation, piece by piece. But I think it was important that from our perspective, this wasn't something that came up overnight. This was something that was thought about, something that was deeply considered, something that was really discussed in multiple meetings. And so this, however, started to tell Interior, our trustee, as well as the world, you know, how we feel, how Tribal Council feels, how our members feel about that river. And so, kind of summing all that up, early November of last year, Tribal Council took that step, approved that resolution. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but I want you to focus there on the bottom one. And so just a minute ago, I talked about building that record and building step by step. I mean, from my perspective, it's like building a wall. You brick after brick after brick. Thank you. And so I want to begin with acknowledges the river is alive in each tribal member. It is at the essence of what it means to be a tribal member, is that river. Okay, and so in the resolution, and you know, the reality is I remember a law school professor telling me that you're supposed to focus on all the words, not some of the words. But there are some words I think merit us talking about for a minute. And so, again, what we're doing, and I repeat myself, but we're building the record. We're building it step by step. We're building that brick wall. And so we just talked about in the last slide, it's alive in each tribal member. Now we're establishing that it is a living being and that it carries and sustains life. Just think about that. It's living and it carries and sustains life. So we're now connecting the threads between the river in each member and the river is carrying life. And so we build on that and we talk about the simple reality that it's in each tribal member, the river sustains life. So the next step is acknowledging that it affects tribal members, that the health of the river is directly linked to the health and well-being of tribal members. I mean, it's a given, and I think for many of our tribal members it was given, but this is part of the building block, establishing that record, building that record, showing how important this is for the world to see. This then starts to get to the next part of the conversation. Having established that this is in every tribal member, having established the river is alive, having established that how the river is treated and functions affects tribal members, Tribal Council is now saying, we're going to start thinking about that every time we make a decision. Every time we talk about the river, every time we talk about planting, every time we talk about restoration, every time we have a conversation about our allocation, every time we are engaging in the river, we are going to be mindful that that river is in every tribal member, that that river carries life with it, okay? And that tribal members and their ability to have health and welfare, their ability to practice what they want to practice, how they want to practice, those are all linked together. And so what Tribal Council is saying is not just now, but going forward, this governing body is going to account for the river as it makes decisions. That is really kind of at the core of what this resolution is doing. And so as we're building our case, building our wall brick by brick, to me, I think this summarizes it, and I hate to say it, I'm going to talk about Darrell B. Hill twice in my presentation, but he talked about sovereignty this morning, okay? And so sovereignty, in this instance, this is an expression of values, in my estimation. This is expressing what is important to tribal members. This is acknowledging a gift that has been handed down through the centuries, that this tribal council and these tribal members have an obligation to protect for the next ones, okay, for Councilwoman's daughter who stepped out. I mean, that's really what this is acknowledging, is that there is no greater expression of sovereignty, no greater expression of what we can do to protect our people than to steward, secure for future generations what's been given to us. I mean, this really ties together all the bricks that we've been laying, quite frankly, is how this has been put together. And in many respects, I think this is just spectacular language. It's just spectacular language. And so the question now comes, okay, what does this all mean? And I get questions all the time about it. And so what we're talking about, as we said a minute ago, future tribal councils will address the needs of the river. And so, again, this is not a one-size-fits-all. This was developed by tribal council to give flexibility, to acknowledge that different transactions may involve different needs to reflect the requirements to reflect the needs of the river. So it could include habitat conservation and restoration, in-stream flows, but I want you to focus on the bottom one. I want you to focus on the bottom, because so much of this is about now, so much of this is about the future. So a part of this is education of tribal members, making sure that the next generation has an opportunity to see and understand what this generation and past generations have done for that river. So education is going to be a huge, huge part of how this tribal council and future tribal councils move forward. Focus on the top one. I think this was important for us, which is it's a sacred obligation, an obligation of one of the highest orders, that we will protect the river, and we will do what we can to protect that river. And I think it just kind of wraps up what is involved in this declaration by tribal council. So when that happened, and when council took this action in November, and there were press reports coming out before then that this was about to happen, a lot of friends and colleagues reached out to me and wanted to understand, you know, what does this mean? And what does this mean for us? Does this mean that we're now going to have Crit tribal police going in the upper basin and handing out citations for people who are not using water wisely? I mean, I had questions like that, quite frankly. But this is about here and now. The river is in peril, okay? And the bottom bullet. This tribal council has decided that they need to take action, because if they don't take action first, who will? This river is their namesake. This river reflects who they are and who they have been and who they will be. And so their decision was not to wait on anybody else, but to do what they can do within the abilities that they have to influence what's going on, is to take that action. That's really, really what's going on here, is taking an affirmative step, exercising sovereignty, backing up sovereignty with actions, doing what they can to protect what is important to them for now and for the future. And so then that comes to the question of what is a living river? And so, you know, what I would say is, and I've learned this from Chairwoman, you know, it's all encompassing. A living river is more than a vessel that moves water from point A to point B, which is a lot of what we have right now, quite frankly. A living river is a river that rises and falls. It's a river that has an active floodplain. It's a river that supports life in all forms, from the smallest to the biggest. It's a river that provides refuge for individuals. It's a system that allows somebody to go and put their hand in the water and feel the water and know that you are connected to something that's bigger than you. That is what a living river is, quite frankly. It is a link from the past, but it's also this bottom bullet, and I want to just simply say it. Crit's water rights and their reservation date back to 1865. And part of that promise to Crit is a living river. That reservation was there long before reclamation showed up, long before statehood in Arizona, long before Hoover Dam showed up. That river was alive and it functioned. And that was part of the promise made by the United States to the Colorado River Indian tribes on March 3rd of 1865. And one thing you will hear from Crit a lot of is that right now that promise has not been met. It has not been met. And that is something that we are working on with our federal friends to acknowledge and to start working on how to make that happen. And so that's an important point that you'll be hearing from Crit a lot more. Back to my point a minute ago, we're not going to go in the upper basin. We're not going to start giving out citations. We're not going to start doing all of that. That's not what we're doing. What we're doing is controlling what we can. Controlling that river once it comes into Crit reservation lands. Once it enters those lands, and I don't have a map here, I apologize, that splits California and Arizona. What we're saying is we're going to take steps to control what we can. And so the simple reality is, Crit with senior water rights, we have a lot of interest in entities wanting to know if we want to allow some of our water to be moved off reservation. And what Tribal Council is saying, that if you do business with us, you have to pay the river. You have to pay the river. You have to make sure that resource is going to be there in the long run. Because right now, we don't think the river is properly being accounted for in all of these discussions. So if you're going to work with us, you have to pay the river. So examples, so right now on the ground, with help from reclamation, we are doing a re-regulating reservoir to capture some of the inefficiencies of our irrigation project, but we're doing it in a way that provides significant fish and wildlife benefits because we're going to combine it with an active wetlands. So we have partners at Audubon, I don't know if Jennifer's here, working directly with us on making that happen. And we're connecting that to the river. Another example is in California right now, we are also working on development of forested lands alongside the river, and again, an active wetland. And what's important to acknowledge here is that Crit is using its water to do this. We understand there will be consumptive uses here. This tribal council, this membership is putting up, quite frankly. They're taking steps to put up what they said they're going to do, and they're doing it. So what I'll say in final thoughts is, and just go back to where we started and acknowledging that this is at the end of the day, this is about doing the right thing for tribal membership. This is about protecting their traditions, protecting their ability to practice the way they want to practice their culture. That's really what this action is about. It's about protecting what we can. It's about doing what we can. And because we're in a position where some will come to us and ask for water, it's about making sure that when our water is used, it's being done in a way that is smart. It's being done in a way that will help sustain the river, quite frankly, and hopefully being done in a way that will prove that you can do both. You can sustain the river. You can have a healthy ecosystem, and you can also be smart about how you use water. So thank you very, very, very much.
Morning, everybody. We are nearing lunch here. It's a great honor to be on sharing a table with these two folks that are doing such great work in the Colorado River Basin, along with their colleagues who they represent. And to be speaking to a room today that has so many people in it that, as a reporter, I've called many times over the years, including while I was working on this book, to hear a little bit about their expertise. in the Colorado River Basin, and I know there's so many experts and so many different aspects of these issues in the room. This book came out a little over a year ago from Torrey House Press in Utah, and it really tries to look at what's happened in Lake Powell and to Glen Canyon since 1999, when Lake Powell was last full. It's, of course, a story that has a lot to do with the Glen Canyon Dam that creates Lake Powell, but I like to start these presentations as I start the book by acknowledging and recognizing the irrigators who came before us. The first reservoir that I'm aware of in Glen Canyon was not Lake Powell. It was this 10,000-gallon reservoir that was built by ancestral Puebloan farmers around 900 years ago, surrounding a spring that was coming out of the Chinle Formation. This site was excavated by archaeologists who were working on the archaeological salvage project as the Glen Canyon Dam was being constructed, trying to survey areas that were going to be flooded by Lake Powell. And they uncovered this pretty remarkable feature. It had 5-foot thick walls all around it, packed with watertight clays and mortar, and just one little opening at the bottom. That was about the size of a $50. So presumably the spring would fill the tank, and when it was time to irrigate, someone would go down to the bottom of the pool and pull a plug in that opening, and water would flow out through a constructed canal system about a half-mile down slope. It branched as it went down, had head gates on it, and was capable of irrigating several acres worth of crops. Now, this was, an impressive feature, and the engineers behind it were wisely put the opening to this reservoir at the bottom of the tank. That way, if they wanted to get out all the water that was in that reservoir, they could let it drain completely. And if they didn't need all of the water for that given day's irrigation, they could replug it and let it refill. When the Glen Canyon Dam was being constructed, there were 2 giant tunnels drilled through the sandstone cliffs around the dam site that allowed the crews to operate in a more or less dry area. But as the dam was nearing completion in 1963, both of those tunnels were filled with reinforced concrete. Now, as we heard this morning from somebody who's far more of an expert in this issue than I am, Glen Canyon Dam is working. It's worked for its entire time. There were good reasons for designing the dam the way it was designed. But I think we also have to acknowledge that it was designed under an assumption that we wouldn't be facing the hydrology that Brad indicated, or that we're already seeing, and what Brad Udall indicated we might be seeing in the future. And if 3,500 is the lowest elevation we're going to see for Lake Powell, we have to recognize that means there is over 5.5 million acre-feet of water that's essentially trapped in Lake Powell with no easy, realistic way to access that. You could go a little lower, as we heard this morning. There are concerns there. And I just want to point that out as, part of the issue. And of course, we're approaching that 3,500-foot elevation. At true dead pool at 3,370, Lake Powell would still stretch 100 miles upstream into Glen Canyon, would contain millions of acres of water feet, millions of acre-feet of water. And at 3,500, it would stretch over 120 miles into Glen Canyon. So let me back up a little bit and talk about the ways in which the conversation around the Lake Powell has changed, kind of through my own story. I grew up in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, learning to kayak on the Shoshone section of Colorado below the dam there. In the 90s, when Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam, things were going pretty good, generating a ton of power, storing a lot of water, and everything was going more according to plan. And both my parents were public school teachers in Glenwood, and every summer they'd take my sister and I out on multi-day river trips, especially in Utah on the Colorado River and its tributaries. And on those trips, we'd often hear about another river trip that was not accessible anymore, which was the Colorado River through Glen Canyon. And by all accounts, everyone here I'm sure knows, Glen Canyon was considered to be the most beautiful, or one of the most beautiful canyons on the entire Colorado River system, a place that would almost certainly be a national park today had the Glen Canyon Dam not been built. Not just because of the 186 miles of river that was flooded on the Colorado, but because of the 100+ tributary canyons that feed into Glen Canyon with thousands of cultural sites, arches, waterfalls, pools, an incredible amount of water in a pretty dry part of the country. Over 70%, I believe, of the tributary streams that flow into Glen Canyon have perennial streams in them, supporting these green grottos and glens of cottonwood trees that so impressed John Wesley Powell when he named it Glen Canyon in 1869. Now, as Lake Powell started to fill, it created what is probably the best place to do reservoir recreation on the entire planet. Those streams that you saw previously, became these incredible channels to explore, and millions of people visit Lake Powell every year to enjoy the houseboating, fishing, jet skiing, water skiing, camping opportunities there. And having been on a houseboat once in my life, I get it, man. It's really nice out there. But you kind of have these two competing visions of what Glen Canyon represents among the general public when I talk to people. They're the people that have grown up for generations of enjoying Lake Powell as a reservoir, and then there's this whole other tradition for people who saw Glen Canyon before the dam and, created a lot of hay about that as well, and were pretty heartbroken by its loss under Lake Powell. And for more professional environmentalists like David Brower of the Sierra Club here, a little bit more professional than maybe Edward Abbey, he partially agreed to the construction of the Glen Canyon Dam in the 1950s and regretted that decision for the rest of his life. And the construction of the Glen Canyon Dam was really a turning point, of course, in the history of the environmental movement in the Southwest that galvanized the environmental groups to fight other proposed dams, including in the Grand Canyon. So I know most people know this history, but it doesn't get discussed, as often as it could sometimes, because it is so far in the past at this point and it's been rehashed so many times. But neither of these perspectives, kind of like the Restore Glen Canyon, Edward Abbey style perspective or the houseboating perspective, really has that much to do with water management. And I wasn't exposed to the more details of water management until I grew up, left Glenwood Springs, and I graduated college in 2011. And my friend and I decided we wanted to go on the longest river trip possible. So we went to the source of the Green River in the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming. It was October. We had to snowshoe to get up there. And we started following the little creek that was flowing out of that lake until we had enough water to pack raft. Once we had enough water to switch to sea kayaks, we continued in sea kayaks for the next several months, paddled through places like Echo Park, which is, of course, a proposed dam site as well in the 1950s. And on Thanksgiving week, we made it to Lake Powell. And we spent 7 days battling a headwind, trying to get across Lake Powell as quickly as possible, freezing cold, short days, and we didn't take any time for exploration or to enjoy Lake Powell in the way that most people enjoy it. We got into the Grand Canyon and paddled across Lake Mead and all the smaller reservoirs below the Hoover Dam, and went through Crit territory, and got down to the place at the US-Mexico border where the last remnants of the Colorado River are diverted into a canal system. We got back in our pack rafts and started floating down the canals, and we did that for 5 days until the canals dried up as well. At that point, we continued on foot, bushwhacking and slogging through the mud until we made it to the Gulf of California, looking like you'd expect after 4 months, maybe even worse than you'd expect, after 4 months and 1,700 miles on the Colorado River. The following year, we went to the headwaters of the Colorado River in Rocky Mountain National Park and followed that side of the basin down. This time we were like, we're not gonna kayak across Lake Powell, that was silly. We're gonna take a solar-powered raft, which actually went slower than a sea kayak, went about 2 miles per hour, except when a cloud came in front of the sun, and then it would go about a half mile per hour. So we spent all day, every day, motoring very slowly from Hite to the dam. And at that time, there was a lot of discussion around the potential for restoration in the Colorado River Delta. And that's what we focused on a lot in the writings that were related to the trip. That's what a lot of groups were talking about at the time. In 2014, I was hired as an editor for Canoe and Kayak Magazine. My first assignment was to paddle the pulse flow that was released in the Delta in 2014. It was an incredible experience to float through the areas that we had hiked through several years before, including with local hydrologists. And it seemed like there might be a chance to get more water into the Delta, to do a lot of critical restoration of that habitat there that's so important for aquatic species and for migrating birds and all other forms of life. And if you talked about what low water on Lake Powell meant to a lot of people in like the conservation, river running communities at that time, they would paint a little bit of a Eeyore type picture, you know, it's all mud flats, you know, we need to fill it back up so it can be nice again. And that's kind of what I thought of Lake Powell, even years after, you know, having spent all that time slowly crossing the lake and not exploring around it at all. In 2021, I was working as a reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune, and I had the opportunity to join a group of 25 scientists who were organized by the Returning Rapids Project in Moab to study what then record low levels on Lake Powell were doing for the formerly flooded areas. And talking to the researchers who were on that trip, who were looking at endangered fish and the ecology and the sediment, I learned that, you know, low water on Lake Powell isn't just about these retreating bays that expose what used to be nice places to motor around in. It's not just about the massive amounts of sediment that have been exposed, especially in Lower Cataract Canyon, which dominate the experience if you float through Cataract, and that's where most of the sediment on Lake Powell has accumulated. It's not just about the waterfalls that have formed because of river displacement on places like the San Juan. It's about the habitat in the river sections that are coming back. There are these giant trees that have grown up in less than 15 years since this area was flooded. This is on the San Juan. They're sections of river that look like a river, and they have mostly native species growing on them. There's a lot of river otters. Every time I've gone out in this section below Clay Hills crossing on the San Juan, we see multiple river otters. I'm getting some nods from other folks who have seen it. Peregrine falcons, so many beavers, just like if you're floating at dusk, they're just jumping in every couple feet and slapping their tails. And altogether, 47 miles of the San Juan River have recovered since Lake Powell was full, 42 miles of the Colorado River, 143 miles of perennial and intermittent streams, and all this is part of 100,000 acres of land that used to be covered by Lake Powell that has been re-exposed. So I spent some time with different researchers exploring the recovering river sections and eventually started to get further into the lake and to go up the side canyons that feed into Lake Powell below where the river deltas currently are. So I wanted to take the last few minutes I have to take you on a trip up one of those side canyons. You can pretty much pick any one you want that has a perennial stream in it, and you'll see a similar stages of ecological succession as you walk up an elevation, essentially walking forward through time and seeing what happens to these areas the longer they have to recover. So you start out by paddling or motoring through forests of ghost cottonwood trees that drowned in the 60s and 70s. They're still standing, they still have their bark on them. It's kind of an interesting and eerie experience. Sometimes the water quality is, also interesting. And you eventually get to the edge of the lake and have to leave your boat there and start walking on foot. And you start out by moving through areas that have only been exposed for a few weeks or a few months if the reservoir is dropping. There's tumbleweed growing back in places, maybe some cheatgrass, sometimes huge amounts of tumbleweed that's blown into gullies. There's a lot of historic artifacts out there, which are also, kind of cool to poke around in. Sometimes you can see a place where somebody might have had 7 or 8 Budweisers, it appears, on a given afternoon, and then you walk around the corner and you see this, and you have to wonder whether those two events were linked or not. But if you go a little higher past this zone, where it's just been exposed recently, and you get into areas that have been exposed for 3 or 5 years, you start to see a very different situation. The plant diversity starts to grow. It's much more dense. It's lush. There's cattails growing up under the ghost forests. There's amphibians moving back in. There's beavers that have swam across the lake, even into box canyons, and have started to build dams there again. I like this photo because you can see the bathtub ring at the top, actually above the top of that cottonwood tree. So these are all areas that have recovered entirely since 2000. Sometimes the beavers are so prevalent, it can be hard to walk without getting your feet wet. And these are just such lush green areas with water seemingly pouring out of the rocks everywhere in these springs and seeps. Maidenhair fern can return in as quickly as 1 year. And the trend over time is that native species, cottonwoods, willows, others, are outcompeting invasive species. This is Seth Arns, an ecologist with Western Water Assessment at the University of Utah and University of Colorado, who is wrapping up a 5-year plant survey project in 30 tributaries, I believe, to Glen Canyon, that is just looking at the density and diversity of plants at different elevations. And Seth has found in canyon after canyon that after 15 or 20 years, the ecological recovery has almost been made it indistinguishable from areas that never flooded. In fact, just below the high water mark, just below 3,700 feet, Lake Powell's full pool elevation, there are sometimes a greater density and diversity of native plants than areas above that high water mark, because probably the sediment that was deposited by Lake Powell is so rich in nutrients that it's supporting this recovery, helping it happen even faster. And this has been really shocking to people who are studying this directly. Other canyons, you might not see any vegetation, but you might not know they were underwater for 50 years. Often all the sediment has been washed away and you end up on bedrock again, and you climb higher and the trees get bigger, and eventually you get above the full pool elevation and see areas that never flooded. There are cultural resources that are reemerging. Ancestral Puebloan steps, rock imagery, pottery. Archaeologists have found full baskets and sandals from 1,000 or more years ago that have remained intact despite being underwater for decades. There are historic inscriptions, this one from the 1890s, that have survived. And these are just remarkable places to explore with a lot of inherent value. And a lot of the photos we've seen today, including these next couple in Davis Gulch, these are areas that were underwater as recently as 2020. And just a partial refilling of Lake Powell back to 50% full would flood these areas. There are arches that used to be able to jet ski through that now have willow forests beneath them, and natural bridges that have reemerged. And even the bathtub ring, kind of the first thing a lot of people think about when they think about low water on Lake Powell, is starting to heal. You can see the streaks of patina coming across it there. So where does that leave us? We have a reservoir that's at the center of the crisis on the Colorado River Basin. We have a lot of water that's not realistically accessible in Lake Powell, as we've heard from the Wilburys. And we have what might amount to the largest environmental restoration in the history of the Colorado River Basin, happening on its own with very little active human intervention, that's already unfolded and shown us that more restoration is possible if we give these areas a chance to continue their recovery. And unlike the restoration efforts that are being made in the Colorado River Delta, the restoration of Glen Canyon doesn't require us to set aside any water rights for that work to happen. In fact, it's been happening because there's less water. And we don't need to transfer water rights from any uses in the basin to allow the restoration of Glen Canyon to continue. And I know that Colorado River issues are incredibly complicated. I don't envy anyone in this room who has to make the tough decisions of how to get by with less water. I know that if you pull on one string in the Colorado River Basin, it can have impacts on water users or ecosystems hundreds or thousands of miles away. But I don't think we can write off these areas that have recovered in Glen Canyon as having no inherent value. They have ecological value, cultural value, recreational value, scenic value, and there's so much research left to be done to better understand what's happening there and how these areas are responding to having the opportunity to come back. And I also know that if there was one good wet year, which we would all, of course, welcome, and Lake Powell were to refill partially, say to 50% full, it would have some trade-offs. It would create new forests of ghost trees. And I think if that were to happen for a short period of time and then drop back down again, while there was still plenty of storage unused in Lake Mead, that would be a tragedy, in its own right. Maybe not on par with the original flooding of Glen Canyon from a certain perspective, but it would have real losses and real consequences. So, to refill Lake Powell with having so much extra capacity in other reservoirs in the basin would certainly have consequences. So if you haven't had an opportunity to go to Glen Canyon or Lake Powell, or if you've been on the lake but you haven't gotten past those mud flats and tumbleweeds that often surround the immediate lake level, I urge you to do so. You won't regret it. It's amazing to explore these areas and to stand in places like the cathedral in the desert, which are accessible again for the first time in generations. And I think that going there, as it did for me, gives you some solace in knowing that in the midst of the water crisis we're facing, in the midst of climate change, that there is a real cause for celebration about the ecological recovery that's happened and is happening in Glen Canyon. So thank you all so much.
Now I'll turn it over to the Slido team to work through a moderated discussion.
Well done.
All right. John, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to combine a few questions that we got from the audience. And I think these questions are really about lessons that were learned during the CRIT process that might be applied more broadly. So I bucketed them into an external and an internal question, and I'll start with external. So I think the audience was hearing that CRIT is both a very senior water rights holder in the basin and has adopted a rights of nature resolution. So the audience is asking for you to expand how we sort of reconcile the prior appropriation system and the rights of nature in the Colorado River Basin. And then internally, there were a lot of questions about the timeline and process for tribal member consultation and what the timeline for implementation looks like. So I'll give you a little bit of time to answer all of that.
So we'll go with the first question first. So CRIT has water rights dating back to March 3rd, 1865. That is the senior-most tribal right in the lower basin. I believe there is one water right in California from 1856 for a very small amount of acre feet. So effectively, CRIT is the most senior water right in the Colorado River. And unlike a lot of tribes who have, I'm getting echo here, it'd be better if I stand up, or can you hear an echo? I'm hearing an echo. Okay. A lot of tribes who settle their water rights as a part of that water rights settlement, it's included authorization from Congress to be able to have your water be used off reservation. Because CRIT has senior rights that are reflected in the Arizona v. California decree, we had no such legislation because we have no such settlement. And so reaching back into the late 20-teens with DCP and all that, it became an understanding that as you're looking at the lower basin and you're looking at water users, CRIT with a very senior water right was a potential entity that could help. And so first things first, we had to have an act of Congress authorizing us to be able to allow our water to be used off reservation. And so through that act of Congress, I think there is a lot of discussion about how CRIT can help with the conversation that's going on right now about allocating shortages and who's getting shorted. And so I think if I'm answering your question, Celine, what CRIT has done is basically say that we can't control what happens outside of the reservation boundaries. We can control, as an act of sovereignty, what happens to our water if somebody wants to use it off reservation. And we can require certain commitments and actions to occur as a part of the potential use of CRIT water off reservation. And so that's how we are able to take this idea of personhood and make it unique to us. Because what we're saying is that our senior right is something that a lot of others are interested in coming to us and asking us to help them. And we're saying that as a part of that conversation, we're going to have a conversation about the river. And we're going to have a conversation about what is necessary to protect the river, because at the end of the day, if we don't protect that resource, we're all in trouble. So that's, I hope I'm answering your first question, Celine. The second question is, there was a lot of conversation with membership, a lot of outreach, a lot of holding, we had CRIT celebrates Water Rights Day. We had a conversation there. We had separate conversations with membership, opportunities for them to come in and meet with tribal council, to meet with me, to meet with others, to talk about it. And again, the overwhelming point from so many tribal members was, well, this is how we feel already. This is just simply a codification. But there is some conversation about just understanding, well, what does this mean exactly? How will this be implemented? But I think what I would say is we spent months and months and months having those conversations, making sure that membership was fully informed, because at the end of the day, tribal council is taking this action on behalf of membership.
Thank you, Amy. I'll give you a few questions as well. So there are some questions about the historic tension and conflict between the agricultural west slope of Colorado and the urban eastern slope, and some curiosity about how this project fits and what the discussions have looked like about the future use of the Shoshone water rights with the eastern slope users.
Yeah, thanks, Celine. I had a colleague the other day say, I think we should retitle you as the Director of Peace, and Andy can be the Director of War. Please don't fire me, Andy, but you'll get my version of this. And I would say I think there are so many on Colorado's Front Range that are supportive of this project. Our economies in Colorado, are very connected. I myself lived in Denver for a decade. I got married there. I had my first kid there. I think there really is broad-based support on both sides of the divide, recognizing that folks recreate on our rivers on the western slope. They come to raft and ski and fish, and they recognize and agree. I think this was said early on in this conference, that nobody disagrees that we should have a healthy flowing Colorado River. And in my mind, I think this whole transaction really shouldn't be an east slope versus west slope tension. You know, if you remember, the goal of this project is to preserve an existing historical flow regime that's been on the river. And so all of our large projects on the Front Range have been built on the premise that this water right exists. And so this isn't a project about taking more water from the Front Range and keeping it on the west slope. This is a project about preserving these flows that we have on the river. You know, our mission at the Colorado River District is to protect and advocate for west slope water users. Missions of Front Range water providers are to provide for millions of people that rely on them for drinking water. And so you can see that in these Venn diagrams, we come from inherently different missions, but really this is the importance of process in this transaction. We went through a very thoughtful process going through the acquisition of the water rights through the in-stream flow program. We're going through a very rigorous process right now in water court to determine, again, what is that historical use so that we come out of this transaction preserving these flows in the Colorado River, but we do so in a manner that doesn't injure other water rights and doesn't enlarge these water rights.
Thanks, Amy. Zach, I'll move over to you. There's a number of questions about what you presented and what this means for the post-2026 operational negotiations. And they range from a question about how we can afford to lose storage capacity in the lower basin, even with what you presented, to questions about, you know, is the Department of Interior paying attention to impacts of Glen Canyon on the watershed upstream? So how are you seeing what you presented today fit within the negotiations for the management of the river?
I have, not been privy to the negotiations, of course, just seeing what's in the news. But I think it's the ecological recovery that's happened in Glen Canyon isn't a huge piece of the discussion. There is a lot on people's minds, and they don't. There's a lot that needs to be worked out, and I think that's not a guiding principle in the bigger conversations. I could be wrong on that, but I think it's often seen, my takeaway from being involved with this project is that there is a bright side to this crisis. I don't know what that makes me. If Brad is Eeyore, maybe I don't know who maybe I'm Winnie the Pooh, the happy idiot, that I'm like, whoa, look, a tree growing over there. This is cool. And everything's kind of falling apart. But I think there is, as I said in the talk, there's something to celebrate in Glen Canyon despite the lower water levels. And I think if I read the most recent Traveling Wilburys paper correctly, they're essentially, if you took water from all 46 reservoirs in the Colorado River Basin and moved all of that water to Lake Mead today, it would barely fill up Lake Mead. There's a huge oversupply of reservoir storage capacity within the basin, and we can think about where we want to store water since we have so much excess storage capacity, and to think about what areas have values as former lake bed and which areas should be used as current lake bed if we get the flows to return to that. But I know there are many other considerations that need to be had in that discussion as well that don't just have to do with the beaver dams and cottonwoods.
Great, and this question can be for any and all of you. So there's some questions about money. So there's a question about how the economics of in-stream flows in the upper basin stack up against consumptive uses like farming and ranching. And then there's another question about whether there is a way to demonstrate how paying attention to natural systems benefits communities, economies, and the river itself. So what do you have to offer the audience about the money side here?
I think, the purchase price for the Shoshone water rights is $99 million. I think we will look back many years from now and recognize that that was an immense return on investment for the benefits that this provides. So the river and all of our water users. And I think the essence of this transaction is you can still have projects that benefit the health of the river, that support local food production, supports drinking water. You know, we've done some economic analysis of what are the broad benefits of the Shoshone water rights, and that study determined a net present value of over $600 million based on its benefits to the broader Colorado River Basin system, benefits of reducing these the salinity in the Colorado River by keeping these dilution flows, by supporting the recovery of endangered fish species. Looking at all of the broad-based nature of these water rights is important, and I think that's what's built into the purchase price and why there are so many public entities that are eager to provide their support. And so in our fundraising effort, I have been in front of some of the reddest counties in our district that have put $3 million into this transaction. I've been given a $5,000 check from a soil conservation district speaking at a local cattlemen's event because they come up to me recognizing that this is going to pay dividends for their livelihoods, for their children, for future generations. And so honestly, the money side of it for Shoshone has been a pretty, wouldn't say easy, but it's been a story to tell. And I think that's, when you look at fundraising $99 million with taxpayer money completely, you can recognize the immense value that these water rights have to the public.
So I think, well, I'll begin by saying that my mom once told me anybody who says money is unimportant is somebody you should never listen to. So I'm not going to say money is unimportant, but I will say that cultural values, non-use values, non-consumptive use values need to be a part of the conversation, and they're not. And I think that if they're not part of that conversation, we will find ourselves with a river that one day is not going to snap back because we're stretching it and we're pulling it and we're moving it in all sorts of ways. But are we actually making sure that we're accounting for the fact that 100 years from now, will this river still be there? And what will it look like? And I think those cultural values, for lack of a better term, I think should be occupying a space that is at a minimum equivalent to the economic conversation that's going on around us.
Well, I can talk money. Not really. I don't really have any numbers, but I think you could probably do an interesting study comparing, the acres of habitat that were restored in the Colorado River Delta thanks to the pulse flow and the follow-up environmental flows that have been done in the Delta to the acreage that was recovered in Glen Canyon. And, the Glen Canyon didn't have any cost for setting aside water rights. The Delta had a certain cost that was used to transfer those water rights to environmental flows. I also think there's a question of what the value of the water is in dollars and cents for the 5.5 to 6 million acre feet that's not realistically accessible in Lake Powell at below 3,500 feet. Desal costs upwards of $1,000 an acre foot. So that's a lot of value that's not accessible in Lake Powell under the current design of the Glen Canyon Dam with the hydrology we've been seeing. So I don't have the hard numbers there, but there's definitely some considerations to be had around whether or not we want to continue operating the system as it's been operated if we're going to see 8 million acre foot average years in the future or less.
Well, thank you all. John, I'm going to turn back to you. There's a question about whether you've seen any changes in how third parties, including the federal trustee, deal with CRIT after the declaration.
So I have to give Reclamation its due. I mean, they have been working with us. They have provided us funds to do some necessary studies for our re-regulation reservoir to include that environmental component. And quite frankly, they haven't questioned it. They've committed to doing that, and we're working with them and other partners at Audubon, for example, on some of the other work we're doing. So I would say, number one, I think there's a willingness to lean in. Number two, I think there's a lot of discussion about what does this mean, and how will this affect us? And we've had conversations with other entities in the lower basin who have asked that fundamental question. You know, they want to talk with CRIT about water, and the first question is, well, what does this mean for us? And so I think one of the successes, I will say, an early success, is actually having that conversation, having that dialogue. We don't know where it leads, but before this action was taken, that dialogue wasn't occurring. So I would consider that an early and initial success.
All right, Amy, I have another question for you. How might the Shoshone water rights contribute toward an upper basin conservation pool for contributions to post-2026 operations?
Yeah, thanks, Celine. You know, I can give my own opinion as a former state of Colorado staffer. I'll make that disclaimer, I guess. These are my thoughts. You know, I can say that, you know, it can be personally hard at times when you're working early and late hours on a project like this to hear, you know, the upper basin isn't doing anything, we're not contributing anything. And I do think the Shoshone water rights is an example of a voluntary transaction of water users in partnership with the state of Colorado that has real benefits to the system. So I mentioned that, you know, we've done some modeling of what is the yield of these water rights. We did some modeling related to the 15-mile reach. For those that know of that stretch, it's right near the Colorado-Utah border in the Grand Junction, Grand Valley area, that demonstrated that in a dry year, even under future growth, future depletions, the exercise of these water rights provides 35,000 acre-feet to the system. And so I do think there's a role to recognize these efforts of preserving these flows and preserving them flowing westward into the system. You know, another way to put this is, you know, and panels are going to talk about upper basin conservation programs later of, you know, but for these flows, if these flows were not in the river, because we're preserving the exercise of these water rights, you know, the tool that we've looked at is conservation that results in fallowing or partial fallowing productive agriculture. And if you look at that yield that these water rights provide, using the rates within the System Conservation Pilot Program, you're looking at a temporary transaction that would require an annual cost of about $17 million to get about the equivalent acre feet that these water rights provide. And in Western Colorado, our agriculture is 95% operated by family farms and ranches. These are our neighbors, our friends. That equates to about 100 family farms, given the average farm size in our district, that would need to be fallowing productive agriculture just to get us back to the baseline of what these water rights provide. So I absolutely think there is role for these actions that are being undertaken in the upper basin to be part of the conversation.
All right. I think the next question came in while Amy was speaking, but it might be something that John also wants to weigh in on. So how are tribes treated in water court when their water rights are negatively impacted on usage due to lack of infrastructure funding to use their water?
So say it again. Let me think about this.
How are tribes treated in water court when their water rights are negatively impacted on usage due to lack of infrastructure funding to use their water?
So I can't talk from experience about water court here in Colorado. What I will say is this. At CRIT, we have the oldest Indian irrigation project in the United States. Initial portions of that project were built in the late 1800s. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs has made a conscious decision to inadequately fund it. And so all of our ability to use water comes to that irrigation project. Depending upon the year, that project has an efficiency that ranges in the low 50 percentile. So basically half of what we take off the river, we lose. And being able to change that narrative is unbelievably hard, because the simple reality is that what we don't use flows to juniors. And so while I don't have experience in water court per se, I will say that it is extremely difficult to have the infrastructure necessary for tribes to be able to fully put their water to use. That is really the bottom line, and a lot of what we've been talking at CRIT with Reclamation about is making sure this EIS in the post-2026 world acknowledges that. And again, back to my comments earlier about creating a record, so that it's no surprise that one day, hopefully, we're able to fully put our water to use. And so that's how I would answer that question, Celine.
All right, I think we have one more question, and Zach, I'll direct it at you. What does successful engagement from stakeholders on what's going on in Glen Canyon look like to you?
That's a big question. I mean, so many stakeholders. I just hope that, people start to recognize what's already there. It's not a theoretical situation in the future that someday these areas could come back. It's already happened. As some of the research has indicated, it's already happened completely. These ecosystems are completely healed. And there are, concerns about power generation from the dam, which is already being greatly diminished. There's the recreational limits of low water on Lake Powell. Most of the boat ramps non-operational today, and then the much bigger picture of everything that's happening around Lake Powell. But I think all stakeholders in the basin, if they answered Daryl's survey that he referenced this morning correctly, that the rivers have value in themselves, and people have a personal connection to these rivers who are involved in water issues. I hope that more stakeholders start to gain a personal connection to Glen Canyon, and to see that, as I said earlier, in the midst of the crisis, there's a cause for celebration. So.
Thank you all, and I will hand it back to Daniel to close us out.
Thank you all. I know we're approaching lunchtime, but just wanted to give one more note of thanks and applause for our panelists.